Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, president of the London Lyceum and host of Kiffin's Keep. And as always, I'm excited to be with you guys today. Now, before we jump into our topic, a quick reminder to go ahead and like the video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. So a reminder of why you do those three things. If you like the video, that tells me that you enjoyed it to make more quality videos on that topic. If you subscribe to the channel, then that makes sure you get the reminder for all of our quality content that's being produced, whether that's Jake Stone and Jesse Owens talking about Baptisty stuff with Generally Particular, or whether that's some of our roundtable episodes that we do with all sorts of expert scholars across the spectrum, or any of our other online content. And then if you comment, that gives me a lot of feedback on just how these videos are going. So one thing I've realized as I've begun producing more videos is that if you teach in a normal, like in-person setting, you're able to see body language, you're able to read in real time how people are responding to what you're saying. You can in real time see objections, see questions, and stop and pause and say, you know what? Maybe I need to reset how I explain that. In these video formats, it's a complete monologue and you have no idea how the other person on the other side of the screen is understanding and taking these things. So if you comment, that gives me some help to understand if what I'm saying here is clear, if what I'm saying is landing in the correct way, if you agree or if you disagree, if you think I missed something you'd like me to follow up. So go ahead and give me a comment. I appreciate it. It helps me just understand how these videos are really landing on you guys. Now, I did want to talk about PhD related stuff again. So recently on the Twitter sphere, publicly available information that's been out there for a while was republicized, and for some reason the Twitter algorithm decided today is the day that this is going to get picked up, because I've seen this shared before and it just hasn't gone anywhere for whatever reason. So for some reason, it said, yes, we're going to talk about this. So ATS, the Association of Theological Schools, the accreditation body, has data reports for every year for the last 20, 30 plus years, and you can go see enrollment factors, all that kind of stuff. And somebody tweeted out about a large number of PhD students, and that number is 588. And the institution was Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Now, I mention these by name because, well, I want to be transparent and honest. I don't think it does anyone any favors to sort of like subtweet or, I guess, pretend. Or it's not pretending. It's indirectly speaking of someone in particular ways. So I'd prefer transparency. I think that's the right way to do it. I think that's the adult way to do it. I understand sometimes that can be dicey because, well, then you're saying potentially a bad thing, but I haven't even said anything good or bad. I just said that this is the number. So withhold judgment here. I do think the fact that this number is so large occasioned a great opportunity to think through, what is a PhD? Does it even matter if there's a lot of PhD students somewhere? All sorts of questions like that I think are super relevant. We get questions all the time here at the London Lyceum about PhD stuff. About further education stuff. Where should I go? What should I do? What should I look for? And we've done recently a theological education Q&A episode that's on YouTube as well that you can go check out. We got a range of people in that. So we had people who are currently students, people who are professors and teachers, and people who have done education in secular university contexts, in evangelical seminary contexts, in the UK, in America. So I think that's a really nice resource. These comments that I'm going to give are totally my own opinion. So if you want more of a range of opinion, go watch that. I'll put the link in the description. You can check it out. Now for me, when you see these numbers, 588, I think there was a range of sort of reactions to this figure. You have the joy reaction of, yes, I'm pumped that this many people are getting the education and being trained in becoming a theologian of sorts as a pastor potentially. And then you have the opposite range of disgust, which is, I think the original tweet was sort of like, you're degrading the PhD. How is it even possible to supervise this many people, etc. And then I think you have sort of like a middle road of like a critical realism where like, this is just the reality of the situation. and maybe there's some work to do here. Let's look at this honestly. And I do realize these topics can be a little touchy. They can be a lot of bit touchy. I mean, you're talking about things in real time, in real life, and you don't want to be a troll about it. So there's a real danger in using real time sort of stuff that comes up and talking about it, that it can become trollish. It can. It's like you're just trying to like throw dirt on somebody. I don't want to do that. That's not what we want to do at the London Lyceum. We're supposed to be about charity and curiosity. So I want to explore these topics with that in mind as best as I can, but we're also about critical thinking. So I want to engage the figures and say, like, let's just look at this as an example and say, what does that actually look like? So I really want to avoid any of the sort of politics that can go on with this sort of stuff. I know people at Midwestern. They're good people. I've got friends like Bradley Sinclair, who I talk with somewhat regularly online. I was able to attend his ETS session last year, and he gave a paper on John Gill, which was superb. So I know firsthand some people who are there doing work, who are studying as PhD students, who are doing quality stuff. So I want to be careful and honest. I want to be careful to properly honor those people, but also be honest about this and help that lead into a useful, profitable discussion. So I think this is an opportunity just to think about, what is a PhD? How does theological education really look? Do pastors need PhDs? Those sort of things. Before we get there, we should look at some of these numbers. And I'm going to link to the ATS reports in the description so you can go check them out for yourself. You can go double check the numbers and make sure that you think that they're accurate. These are publicly available again, so this is what is being reported by the institutions themselves to the accrediting body. These aren't just, made up pie in the sky stuff. Everybody's got a standardized set of criteria that you report on. And now I do work with numbers for a living, and one thing I do know of working with numbers for a living is that you can make numbers tell pretty much any story that you want if you do it in the right way. So you could ignore certain numbers, you could underdefine certain numbers, or you could compare things in ways to other comparison groups that don't really tell the full story. So what I'm going to show here on the screen, just to give you a little context as we discuss the overall issue, is what you're going to see here is I just put together a little chart. It's quite simple. You're going to see the school, the number of full-time faculty, the number of total full-time students, the number of full-time PhD students, the number of full-time DMin students in these columns, and then you're going to have the percentage of doctoral students total compared to your total students. So that'd be like PhD, DMin, total, divided by total students. And then you have the next couple of columns, the PhD per faculty member. So that's number of full-time PhD students per faculty member. Then you have the total number of students per faculty member. I guess I meant total number of PhD and DMin per faculty member. And then I did another one that was like, let's count the DMin as a half. Because I imagine DMin doesn't require nearly as attentive supervision. So let's just count them as half of a PhD student to see what those numbers look like. And I put in some control groups in here. So I put in some comparisons. So I put in all the SBC schools, and I put in just a smattering of like, here's 8 possibly related institutions. So you've got like Asbury and Calvin and Ted's and Fuller and Liberty. So these could be somewhat more similar and somewhat less similar, but these are just a way of comparing yourself to everybody else. And then below that, you're going to see what I've put together, the average SBC in total. Then you have the average SBC without Midwestern, and then you have the average non-SBC school. And you can see those figures right there for yourself. And some things that I just jump out at me, yes, Midwestern does have elevated doctoral students, but that doesn't seem to be out of line with other institutions. I mean, Fuller's right there at 51%. And to me, that doesn't seem like that's necessarily like, so what if you have a bunch of doctoral students? Maybe that's just your passion, your mission. Like, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that as you think about, do I want to do a PhD somewhere? Then you have, though, the PhD students per faculty member. And it's pretty clear that, Midwestern's significantly higher at 22.6, whereas the second highest is 4.2. And then you have the total, which is 34.5 or 28.6, depending on what you look at. 34.5, the next closest is 7.8. So, I mean, they are definitely significantly inflated. And you can see here what I did at the very bottom was like, how many multiples of the faculty would you need to get to the average SBC, which is that green line. The blue line is the average SBC without MBTS, and then that yellow is the average non-SBC. So you can see that they would have to significantly increase their faculty to get to average there. But is that even a problem? Is that even a worry that maybe they have a lot of PhD students and not a lot of faculty? We don't know. That's part of what we want to think here is like, does that matter? What does matter in thinking through PhD studies and where you should go, those sort of things. I should mention that Charles Smith tweeted out something related to this figure. So it shows here, Midwestern reported 26 full-time faculty members. And then Charles said, we have 60 plus professors with faculty status and many others serving as adjuncts and supervisors. Most faculty supervise 4 to 8 students at any moment. I currently have 6. And so what he's trying to say is, let's look at these numbers and say, well, that's not really telling the whole story, which, you know what, that could be possibly be true. I mean, maybe they misreported some things. I am a little concerned just because I think that number is not representative of everybody else. So if you want to, when you're doing data stuff, it's very important that you compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So if we're going to count professors with faculty status, whether they're full-time or not, and whether they are actually affiliated with the institution or not, you've got to be able to do that for every other institution. And if you can't do that for every other institution, then you can't use those figures to really relativize what's going on. So I do think the 26 faculty member is probably the accurate one. And it's also important to think through how many of these faculty members can actually supervise dissertations. How many should be supervising dissertations? So, for example, if you have a professor of graphic design, they probably are not going to be supervising PhDs in theology. So you just want to think through these things as we look at these numbers. I think this is a little bit cooking the books. I mean, that's what they would call it in my data sphere a little bit, I think, where you're not doing accurate data analysis. But what I don't want you to take from that is that Midwestern is by like a terrible institution or something. That's not the point. That's not the point of this episode at all. The point of this episode is to look through and think, how do we think about PhD studies in general? Because the reality is there can be and are great students that come through institutions with a lot of PhD students, and there are really bad results from small cohorts of PhD students. You know, you could go to an elite program with 6 students and you could get a terrible education. That's very well possible. So I think these numbers are not going to just tell you by and large that, oh, yep, if you have 588, then you're a bad program, or if you have 6, then you're a great program. That's not necessarily true. So this is an opportunity to think well about that. Because let me give you an example. I went to Liberty University for my undergrad education. And I don't tell people that a lot just because of the various factors that come in with it. People think, oh, you must be an online student. I wasn't. Residential. They think, you know, you must be Jerry Falwell Jr., reincarnate or something. And I'm like, no. And all sorts of related things. But there's also I think one aspect is people think that there is a poor quality of education there. They have poor professors, poor faculty. The institutional standards are lax. They're not really serious about grades. And some of that, for Liberty, I think is true. However, I actually obtained there an excellent education. I had excellent professors who taught well, and I'll be honest, I think most of the classes that I took there are actually on par or more difficult than some of the classes I took in my later master's degree at Southern. And I love Southern. So I think I actually received a great education at Liberty, despite having some of my initial classes, 700 students to the 1 teacher ratio. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that's wise. I don't think that's conducive to really forming students and helping to teach them. Some of my upper level classes, 400 level or whatever they were, 50, 60 students or more, not a great thing in my opinion. And yet I still received an excellent education. So you can't just assume that because there's a lot of numbers or there's a little numbers that you either have a good or a bad program. That's just not how it works. You have to dig deeper and to think more. However, I do think it is relevant to think about the numbers when you are looking at a PhD program, because I do think it's probably not a healthy practice to have a significant number of students per supervisor. And here's why. Let's just talk about what a PhD should be. And I think this will help us to understand and think through, if this is what it should be, then we should want as few students to supervisor as possible. Obviously, you need to have more than just one or two for most institutions, because they just don't have the finances to be able to employ supervisors who only do one or two. They need to do more than that. So I think a PhD is fundamentally about apprenticing yourself to an expert mentor for guidance on a specific research project of the highest quality. Now, I think this is going to play into some of the things that I want to talk about next. It's designed to form proper habits, proper sort of virtuous person with virtuous dispositions, and it's also designed to serve as a quality check. So that's why it's a credentialing tool. It's supposed to say, if you've passed this PhD, then you are trusted to do academic quality research, to make arguments and understand different people's positions and to represent them fairly and accurately. So that's, I think, its main purpose. However, there are, I think, as this sort of like, wow, there's a lot of PhD students, there's been a lot of defense of having a lot of PhD students saying, no, I actually got a great education there. And moreover, it doesn't even matter because of reason X, Y, or Z. But I think this is important to think about when we're thinking about just the PhD. It's not supposed to be remedial practice after your MDiv. So it's not supposed to be, let me fill in the gaps in your education by doing a PhD. That's not the point. The PhD is supposed to be building on existing research in a further, narrower, specific, nuanced way. It's not designed to fill in educational gaps. You will especially find that the case if you go do a UK model where you don't have any coursework. I would suggest, if you feel like you have gaps, do another master's. Probably do a THM. I think the THM is a fantastic degree. I highly recommend it all the time. I don't think a PhD serves the church by being sort of like a stopgap. I think it's supposed to advance specific study. I think this is a major source of confusion. So my friend Danny Slavich, he tweeted out a couple of things on this topic, which I think serve as really useful tools to think about what is the PhD, what is it for, what is it not for, and relevant. So like, I'm not trying to like trash talk him or anything. I'm just using this as, this is really nice conversation starter to think through what is a PhD. So he says he thinks the PhD is worth the process of learning how to learn, no matter, like, let's just say let's say, for instance, it was a degree mill somewhere. You went institution Y, it's a degree mill because they give out 500 PhDs, but that doesn't matter, because what's important is as long as it teaches you how to learn, then it's successful. He says, I didn't know how poorly I would read and study until I did a PhD. The value of a PhD for a pastor isn't ultimately the product, but the process of formation. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the purpose of a PhD. It's not just the process of formation. It can do that, and it does do that. It does form you. However, I think, let's take an example. If I went to medical school, and in the process of being a medical student, I learned how little I know about biology or the human body. That doesn't mean that that's the purpose of that degree, or that everyone should go get that degree. I think you can be told you don't know how to read well. You can be told that you don't understand all sorts of things well without doing a PhD. There's all sorts of great avenues to do that. It's not a magic pill that solves all your problems, that suddenly you know all the areas that you suck at and all the areas that you need to get better at, and here's how to do it. I think that actually, let me say this. I think you can actually learn those things not by doing a PhD, but by applying to a program, being told, no, you're not ready yet, apply again next year, or this isn't the program for you or something. That can actually serve as the check that maybe you don't know everything you thought you know. And what I would want to add to this is, what if I told you that there was actually a more affordable and less rigorous way to obtain this knowledge that you didn't know how to read well without doing a PhD? So you didn't have to spend the money, you didn't have to potentially wreck your family, and yet you still gain all these things. I think you can do all these things through other avenues, through other means. You don't need a PhD to do that. And I think you're going to hear this refrain oftentimes. You don't need a PhD. That's my opinion. I don't think pastors need a PhD. If you want to be a scholarly researcher, an academic researcher, you need a PhD. If you want to pastor well, to be a pastor theologian, you do not necessarily need a PhD. So if someone's told you that, get that monkey off your back. You do not need a PhD. All the things that you want to do, you can do without doing a PhD. Go get a THM. I think that's a high quality degree. It's a research oriented degree. It's going to fill in some of those gaps if you feel like you have them. And it's not going to require you to invest 6, 7, 8 years of your life. You can get back to pastoring. Another thing that I think is a little bit confusing about what a PhD is it's not a solo project. So it's a joint project between a mentor and mentee. And I think this is a confusion a lot of people have, and I think this is relevant for the high number of 588, whatever it is, to like 27. So if you go to an institution, you see big disparity here, I would want to have answers. Like, explain to me, like, what actually is going on here? Is this segmented by department? Maybe in a sort of like an applied theology, you have a lot of PhD students, but in the more research concentration heavy areas, you have fewer PhD students. I'd want to know those questions, because I think this is very, very relevant, because if it is a joint project, you should want your supervisor involved from day one and involved throughout the process with you. So this is a confusion. Danny also said the quality of the work for a PhD has always depended on the students. And he goes on, I'm sure that some students at MBTS write subpar dissertations that sneak through, but this isn't unique to MBTS. There are mountains of trash dissertations from elite institutions. Dead right. There are mountains of trash dissertations from elite institutions, and this isn't unique to MBTS in any way. However, it's not true that the quality depends upon the student. It also depends upon the supervisor. And so if your supervisor is not engaged from day one, from the time you start at the program to the end of the program, I would be concerned, because this is a joint project. If your supervisor isn't regularly involved in providing you significant feedback, I would be concerned. Now, this can be the case for any institution you go to. It could have 5 doctoral students, and your supervisor could be absent-minded completely. He could be off in his own world, just only wanting to do research, doesn't have time for students. So these are sort of questions you want to ask. If you're considering PhD studies, you want to ask number one supervisor, how hands-on are you? But you also want to ask the students of the supervisor, like, what does that relationship look like? Because they're probably going to be more honest with you. Maybe they have a bad experience and they'll tell you that. Maybe they have a great experience and they'll tell you that. But that can really help you here, because I absolutely think this is a joint project. The supervisor is working on this with you. They are contributing. Their name will be on it with yours. And if they don't view it that way, I think that's ultimately a flawed approach to the PhD process. Now, I do think that that's probably a rare thing today, especially in evangelical institutions, because that's just not how they've been trained. You naturally just do what you've seen and witnessed and been taught. And I don't think there's a healthy sort of realization that this is a joint project together. My name's on it just as much as yours. I need to have rigorous standards. So ultimately, if your supervisor wasn't involved in the process of the quality check and then passed you anyway, that's not really a PhD that you're getting. So that's my thoughts there. I think PhDs require the supervisors to be significantly heavily involved and to understand that it's their project too. Another thing is, the PhD is not designed to be a personal journey. If it was, it's a bad one. It's not the right channel either to just simply say, I want to develop my theological chops or something. It does do that. So these are byproducts of a PhD for sure, but that's not the primary purpose of a PhD. It's a project for a specific quality research project. So you're going to study one specific theological thing and not sort of like a list of general things. So Danny's been talking about, I think, pastor theologians, and that's what I'm talking about here, pastors or people aspiring to ministry who want to do these sort of things. I don't think he's talking about those who want to teach academically. If you want to teach academically, naturally, you need to go to the best institution you get into. There are pros and cons to going to an evangelical school or not, because maybe if you want to teach at an evangelical school, they're going to want an evangelical degree. But if you want to teach elsewhere, then it's like the kiss of death. And I don't think that's news to anybody. So this is supposed to be designed to think about pastors. And I just think pastors are supposed to be generalists, to know a lot about a lot, or know somewhat about a lot of stuff. And so a PhD isn't really going to equip you to know all the things you need to know as a pastor. Danny says we need more, not fewer, pastors doing advanced theological education. 99 times out of 100, these pastors will remain pastors and not become professors or professional scholars. But they will be well-formed, lifelong learners with scholarly chops. That's good. And that's right. It is good to have more pastors who have scholarly chops, who are theologically educated. But the PhD is probably not what's necessary for 99 out of 100 of these pastors. And I'm worried that, and this is just across the board, that the sort of watering down of the PhD in all sorts of institutions is ultimately making people think that they're getting a higher quality education than they're getting. But I guess that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that if it's helping their ministry, then it's fine, right? So like, I'm cool with that. But I think there's just naturally some, I know this sounds elitist, but there is some sense of you want to gatekeep certain things and say, look, there is a standard, there is a bar. And if you lower that bar, then that can have negative consequences for other things. I hope that makes sense. Charles Smith also said, in a similar vein, Southern Baptists have given us a job. Our job is not to maintain an elite Ivy League seminary for a few luminaries. To the very best of our abilities is to equip every qualified student your church sends. So I think the idea here is just we want to have as many students as we have or can, and that's why we have a large number. So it makes sense. I guess the main worry here is just that's not really what a PhD is supposed to do. It's not supposed to let's get rid of as many things as possible so we can give advanced education to more pastors. So let's get rid of the language requirements. Let's get rid of residency requirements. And if you have a lot of students, then you don't have the same sort of like personal mentor relationship that you really need to have a quality PhD. So I think there's worries because of what the PhD is. Is it bad to have that many students getting further education? Absolutely not. You want as many as you can. And I would think that every institution would like to have this problem. They would like to have too many students and not know what to do with it. It's just a matter of when you think about what the PhD is this healthy? Is this long-term sustainable? I would say no, it's not healthy. No, it's not long-term sustainable. However, I've seen several professors online say, look, I actually only have 3 or 4 or 5 students at any time. To me, that seems, well, that's reasonable. Then where are the other 500 students going? But I guess you just don't go to that department then, right? So naturally, we want to think, how should we pursue PhD studies? What are some questions that we can ask and think about? Question I get, and others get, should I pursue PhD studies? And my question would naturally be, I think, do you have the itch for learning or do you have the itch for vanity? And by that, I mean, when you want to do a PhD, really discern why do you want it? Do you want it because you just have this insatiable desire to learn and to know and to understand and produce research? Or do you have a desire to be well respected, to be honored, to have positions of authority, or whatever, fill in the blank? And I think if you have that sort of mindset about a PhD, you definitely should not get one. This is only going to feed your ego, and it will ultimately be detrimental to your own spiritual health. However, if you have an insatiable desire to learn, I think the PhD, it makes sense because that's part of the purpose of what it is. I would also ask, do you have the discipline necessary to read consistently and widely and carefully? If you're not a disciplined reader, the PhD process will not go well for you. If you are not disciplined in writing, the PhD process will not go well for you. So please don't do a PhD if you are a bad writer. Go learn to be a better writer and then come back, and the experience will be far more profitable and less painful. I would also ask, what is your goal in pursuing a PhD? So a lot of this discussion here about having a lot of students and having few faculty is thinking, well, what is our goal? Are we training pastors? Are we training academics? If you're training academics, then this seems like obviously this is not a good situation. If you're training pastors, you'd think through, well, what is the purpose of a pastor getting a PhD? And then you start to think, are you currently a pastor? And then you're like, well, if you're currently a pastor, you probably are looking for a modified sort of residency program because you don't want to leave your church, which makes sense. But then that all these sort of questions start bubbling up of like, what is the PhD? What can I give up and still get the same quality education? Does that make sense? Because part of the value of a residential program is that it has sort of like safety measures, safety checks in play, so that it helps to make sure that everybody is getting a quality education. When you lose the in-person residency requirement, you begin to not have the same safety measures in check, and people can start falling through the cracks and not doing the things they need to do to produce quality research and to produce a quality PhD, produce the sort of habits that you need to develop as a skill through the PhD. So residential education doesn't like solve all your problems. It just is sort of like a protective measure. When you lose that, it becomes more difficult. And the same way, I think language is a sort of necessary depending on what program you're in. If you're in a theological program, you need to know the languages. You need to learn Latin. And if you're not learning those things, you are cheapening the PhD, but you're also cheapening yourself. You're cheating yourself, really. That's fundamentally what it is. So some questions on, I think, what you should look for in a PhD. I wanted to touch on that a little bit. So in that theological education Q&A episode that I did with some others, James Eglinton mentioned you should look for a PhD supervisor that's like a Jedi rather than a Sith. I think this was great wisdom that he gave us here. So the idea is that Siths deal in absolutes, my way or the highway, and it's sort of like just content dump. Whereas Jedis teach you how to think well, and they deal more in generalities, and they teach you sort of like the nuances, and it's not so black and white on everything. You want to look for the Jedis and not the Siths. You also want to look for a mentor or a supervisor that's an expert in your area. So you might like and really find some mentor valuable and maybe a great friend and really a great scholar, but they're not in the area that you want to research. Do not study with them. If you want to do theology, don't study with a New Testament guy. If you want to do New Testament, don't study with a philosophy person. Like, you need to focus and study with a person who's an expert in what you're doing. And if you don't do that, you are going to make mistakes in your PhD. You need somebody who's actually read the material that you're writing on and has a good grasp of it and is publishing in it. And if you don't do that, that's a huge mistake. Other advice of what you should look for. I think you want to have a high touch program. You don't want to have too high touch. So there is like a sense of like, I would get annoyed personally if I was being emailed by my supervisor every week, though I don't know of any program that would actually have a supervisor who did that. But I would want to have a program where I had access to my supervisor and whoever your co-supervisor is, whoever the other faculty members are. You want to have access to them, regular access to where they read your work and provide comment on it, where they give you opportunities to present your work to them and other students and get feedback. You want to have a lot of these opportunities to cultivate learning, to cultivate habits, to engage others' work, to hear critiques of your own. You need those to have much higher quality work. So I think those are some things you want to look for. I do think you want to look for it's not just the overall program number. So that's really a red herring. You want to look for your particular supervisor. How many students are you supervising? So before I jumped into a program, I want to know, hey, Professor X, how many current students do you have? 4? Who are they? Let me go talk to each one of them. 4 seems like a reasonable number. If they said I have 10 or I have 12 or I have 15, I would be afraid of I don't want to be 20th in line where you have teaching responsibilities, you are writing books, and you're supervising PhDs, and you have a family, and you have 20 of us. I'd want to have actual opportunity to get real feedback on my work. So I would say that's probably not the person I want to study with, but maybe you want to study with someone else. I don't know. I also think, as far as advice for PhDs, I love doing a second master's in an American model and then doing a PhD in the UK model. I think the PhD in the UK model is vastly superior to the American model, personally. I know people disagree with me on this all the time. That's fine. I like the UK model because it gives you 3, 4, 5, 6 years to work on your dissertation specifically. That's it. Whereas in the American model, you get a year, maybe 2, I guess sometimes if you're really slow 3, because you do your coursework and then suddenly you're writing your dissertation. Now, some people can circumvent this and say, well, I didn't actually write the thesis in a year. I've been writing it the whole time I've been in there because I wrote all my coursework stuff geared towards my thesis. And yet I still don't love that because you're not... A lot of those have to be focused on the course content. It's like whatever course it's in, it has to be geared towards that. And I also think you want to have your actual supervisor reading all of that work and to be focused on it and revising it, putting in an initial essay, getting feedback on it, and then revising it, giving it back, getting more feedback, doing it again. So I really just like doing both of these because I think you do need more coursework. You don't want to just go straight to a PhD in UK and have no general knowledge of lots of stuff. You don't want to just be an inch wide and a mile deep. You want to try to do both things. So another question I wanted to mention is, how do you get the most from your coursework? I'd say get married, have kids. That's a little bit of a joke, but it's honestly serious because I think a lot of guys aren't serious about their education until they realize that they don't have the time to devote to it or the energy to devote to it. And when you have life and kids, you have other things that are more important. And then if you're really wanting to do this, you will actually be far more efficient and productive in your research, in your study, in your writing. Suddenly, somehow, instinctually, you just get better at it. I would also say take handwritten notes. I know there's a lot of value in typing notes and stuff. You need to handwrite your notes. It's been scientifically proven that that retains information more. I also think that you should read all of the sort of suggested reading as much as you possibly can. Think about the topics that you're reading in your coursework. Talk to other people about it. Ask as many questions as you can. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Other questions. Maybe you're in a PhD program now and you do have a busy supervisor and they've just got a lot of students, or maybe they're just absent-minded. And I would have to tell you, you need to network outside. You need to, of that supervisor. You need to talk to the other faculty on staff, get their feedback. Don't be afraid of being a little annoying with your supervisor. Just check in periodically, reminding them hey, I'd love to meet with you. Don't be the annoying person who's asking them every day, because then they're not going to want to talk to you. But just try to regularly just remind them, bump into them, tell them, I'd love to chat with you for 5 minutes or whatever. But I do think it's important to network outside of your institution if that's the case, to make as many relationships as you possibly can. One of the last things that I wanted to touch on is how to become a better scholar at an institution like a seminary or a university. I've been at both. They both have their own issues. They both have their dangers. They both have their own institutional bubbles of sorts where they can get sidetracked with things that don't really help you become formed as a careful, virtuous scholar. I think being a scholar, or a serious scholar, is about being a careful, serious, curious, charitable reader of texts. It also requires you to make original, creative, curious arguments and to read others in the same way. So you want to create them and to understand them in the same way. And in order to do that, I think you need to do a couple of things. As a Christian, you need to memorize James 3. You need to pray, and you need to go to church. You need to do those three things, and the Lord will be gracious to you and help develop your scholarship abilities. We don't need more proud, arrogant scholars. We all struggle with that as humans. I struggle with that. And yet, if we do those things, I think the Lord will be gracious to us. But I also think from sort of like the more like academic side, you need to be committed to writing, you need to be committed to reading, and you need to be committed to learning. There is no substitute for writing. There is no substitute for carefully, slowly reading texts 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Speed reading, skimming reading has its place, but not for the stuff in your dissertation. If it's going in your dissertation, it must be read slowly, carefully, and multiple times. Outline the argument. Understand specifically exactly what it is that they're saying. You cannot mistake somebody when you're doing a PhD. You should not, at least. You need to be committed to these sort of things. And as far as writing goes, I would say commit to sending your work out for peer review, especially if you're in a seminary context. The rigor is just, the expectation of the rigor is not there. So you need to self-motivate yourself, I guess if that's the word, to be publishing as much as you can. I would recommend to at least send out one essay per year to a reputable, blind, peer-reviewed journal. Get it published if you can. Submit it to, every time you get a rejection, look at the comments. If they make sense, revise it, and then send it somewhere else. You need to have your work vetted by peer review because you're going to get good comments on it. And that's going to make you better. And I think there's a lot of institutional politics and problems that go in with the peer review process. But the blind nature of it is still extremely beneficial. Because they don't know that you're a PhD student. They don't know you're a scholar. It's merits based on your actual writing and your argument. And so I think that's really important. I don't think you should be writing books on any topic until you've actually done work through the peer review process. So those are some of my takes. Am I an elitist for saying this? I hope not. I mean, maybe. I don't know. So really when it comes down to PhDs, you want to make sure you have access to your supervisor. And if it's a program with a lot of students, that's probably something you want to just understand. You want to go to the people that would be in your area, maybe your department. It could be that your department's stellar and it has very few students, and that's what you want to do. So even if it has a lot of other students elsewhere, that doesn't really matter for you. I would never want to study somewhere, though, that had adjuncts as a supervisor. And here's why. The adjunct may be awesome, but the adjunct has no skin in the game, no institutional skin in the game. They could leave at any moment, and you'd be high and dry. So I would avoid that. I would also never want to study with someone who hadn't been at least 5 to 10 years from graduating from their PhD, because I want somebody who's seasoned and somebody who's been publishing in peer-reviewed outlets on the topics that I want to write on. You need somebody who's an expert. You don't want to just have somebody who doesn't have these sort of things. So let me reiterate from the beginning. Pastors don't need PhDs. We don't need to water down the PhD in order to educate pastors. There are other avenues. The PhD has a specific purpose and a specific reason. So hopefully this has been useful. I don't want to take shots at anybody. I don't remember what all I said exactly. The point was to use this discussion of lots of PhD students as a sort of a launching pad for thinking about what is a good PhD student or what is a good PhD program, to answer some of those questions. If I didn't answer all your questions and you have thoughts, ideas, drop a comment. If you disagree with me, drop a comment. Tell me what you think. If you agree with me, drop a comment. It's very well I could be wrong about some stuff here. So tell me if you think I'm wrong about something. Tell me if you think it's fine to have 20 students to 1. If you think that's fine, tell me why. I think personally, I think those sort of things are concerning. It's not like a necessary thing where if you have 25 students to 1, it's necessarily going to be a bad thing. It's worrisome. So I would think of it. Let's use a building example. Let's say it's a construction company. Or no, it's not a construction company. It's like a construction education company. Maybe it's a foundation, like it's an institution that teaches people how to lay foundations. And say the normal ratio of apprenticeship is, 1 foundation expert to 5 students, because you have to go out there and you have to like physically show them how to do it and everything and take turns and give practice. Say this other foundation institution grew really fast. Maybe they have cheap tuition. Maybe they're just in a location where lots of people want to get this, whatever it is. And they have 1 expert for every 25 foundation makers. And let's say 5 years goes by, 10 years goes by, they're making great foundations. So who cares? I would still say that seems, unless this has been a common practice across the board, that's probably worrisome. Because if you look in and say, well, in these cases, they actually don't get the same hands-on training. Not all of them are actually practicing putting in the foundation themselves, but they are watching other people do it. There's just a lot of people here, so we don't have all the time to do it. I'd say even if they are producing good quality now, that is a concern, and you should probably fix that. You definitely need to fix that. And I would be worried about going to this institution because that's maybe they got some magic stuff and they figured it out. But if everybody else is consistent in this thing, then I would say, let me just understand a little bit more, ask some more questions. Does that make sense? I think I've met a lot of people from Midwestern that are cool, that have done some good work. I've met Bradley Sinclair, who's done good work. I've met Colton, I don't know how to say your last name. I'm sorry, Strother or whatever. Read some of his work, and it's fantastic stuff. They're doing great work. So this episode is not supposed to be some sort of slam on Midwestern or something. It's using that as a launching pad. So I just want that to be abundantly clear. I do think that the numbers are concerning, and I want to be honest about that. I don't want to lie about that. I want to be a truth teller. I do think part of what the PhD is supposed to be, but that's not a Midwestern thing. This is just everybody, like evangelicals, seems to like water down the PhD a little bit to where it's not what it used to be or what it should be. So tell me, should I talk more about something else related to this topic? I've talked for a long time. It looks like 40 plus minutes, which is insane. I can't believe I talked that long. So should I talk about something specific more, less, move on? Did I get something totally wrong? What do you think? Tell me. Either way, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Hopefully you can tell that I've got a chill attitude about this. Like, I'm not trying to like make any enemies. I'm just trying to be honest and talk about something I'm really passionate about and I'm really concerned about is just, further education and further theological education. I think it matters. I think it's really important that we get it right. I think this all makes sense. So I'm going to stop talking now. You tell me what you guys think. As always, thanks for tuning in, and look forward to thinking with you guys soon.